Hey guys, so today what I'm going to talk about is the role of stretching in evidence based practice. So, all I'm going to talk about is just the effects of stretching and the role it plays in today's injury prevention and soft tissue management scenarios. So, we're talking in the context of a clinic like massage therapy, what have you, and other allied health related fields. So, to delve into this, I pulled up a few meta analyses from evidence of stretching, as well as some interesting information from various studies that I found when I was going through the research for this kind of topic. So I'm just going to get right into it. The first review that we're looking at is the impact of stretching on sports injury risk, a systematic review of the literature. What they did was they looked at databases that contain studies on the effects of stretching all the way from 1966 up to 2002. And they looked at a total of 361 total studies. They excluded studies from certain criteria that didn't have a control and ones that didn't focus on people involved in sports or fitness activities. The authors ended up pulling 6 studies out of those 361 that met those criteria, and what they found was that there was no significant reduction in injuries from stretching. And so, these authors concluded that there was no reason to rely on stretching, but they also mentioned that they didn't see a reason to discontinue it either. So, really, it's up to the clinician or the individual as to whether or not they want to stretch or not. But the evidence in this particular meta analysis shows that there's no real swing towards either way. So, if we're moving on from there, we're going on to the next bit of research that I've brought up, which is the role of flexibility in injury prevention and athletic performance. Have we stretched the truth? That's a pretty funny title, I know. But as far as the methods for the paper, the author mentions that there's scant significant evidence that stretching does anything to increase performance or even reduce injuries. He also mentions that the evidence suggests that general fitness is more important than flexibility for injury prevention, and that increasing range of motion beyond function is more likely to cause injury. If we're continuing from here, we're going to look at the next bit of research, which is titled Influence of Chronic Stretching on Muscle Performance, a Systematic Review, whereby the authors tried to find all studies from the inception of studies on stretching up to 2016. They collected 513 studies in total, and they excluded certain criterias, including special populations such as children, elderly people, and people with disease. As they also excluded people who went through short bouts of stretching, so anything less than 3 weeks or less than 12 sessions of stretching, they got rid of those as well. So they ended up narrowing it from 513 studies to 28, and of those 28 studies, 14 of them showed improvements in muscle performance, and of those increases, it was only in functional tests. So they also looked at isometric contractions and isotonic contractions, of which both of those remained unaffected by the chronic stretching. But it's still worth noting that the functional tests improved, although since it was kind of hit or miss, the authors concluded that there might be a benefit to stretching, but further testing is definitely needed. Next one coming up is titled Current Concepts in Muscle Stretching for Exercise and Rehabilitation. The authors of this review found that any type of stretching is effective at increasing range of motion, although it's more so with the PNF style of stretching. So that's just a certain type of stretch you can look up. But the authors recommend to not static stretch pre-activity and instead perform dynamic warm-ups instead. They also recommended that populations over 65 should incorporate stretching as part of an exercise regimen, so don't just rely on stretching. They also can't even talk today. They also mentioned that stretching can be beneficial in a variety of orthopedic patients. So, to sum that all up, overall the evidence doesn't really support stretching as a big benefit to injury prevention. The studies supporting it only show increases in range of motion from testing and not on the actual muscle contraction or performance. The studies against it show that increasing range of motion beyond functional limits can have a possibility of increasing injury rates. And one more thing I found when I was researching this topic was an interesting study called Yoga-Related Injuries in the United States from 2001 to 2014, where the authors went through something called the National Electronic Injury Surveillance System, which is basically a system that compiles a bunch of recorded injuries in clinical settings like hospitals. So it's just a big database of injuries, essentially. The authors ended up finding 29,590 yoga-related injuries from 2001 up to 2014. And it's interesting that the injury rate increased each year because that also coincides with the fact that the popularity of yoga increased each year. And of those injuries, the majority were from strains and sprains, at a whopping 45% of all those injuries. And the demographics that were injured the most frequently were age 65 and older, which is interesting because the last study we talked about before this one recommended people at the age of 65 and older to continue stretching, although they did recommend part of an exercise-based regimen, not just rely on it. Now, considering all the evidence that we've talked about so far, I'll just give my own opinion of how stretching should be prescribed and how I recommend it to clients in my own clinic. So I guess I would call it like a hierarchy of home care recommendations for my clients is as follows. So the first step, in my opinion, is to increase muscle endurance. So through that would be through isometric training, so holding certain contractions for long periods in one position, and just get people used to the range of motion that they have currently and try and keep that a bit more stable. The second step would be increasing muscular strength in those available ranges. So we're still not pushing outside the comfortable range of the client, but now we're going through the available range of motion by doing contractions through there. So instead of isometric training, we're going through the available range of motion, but we're still loading it with extra weight or increasing the reps, something to that nature. But the sum up for step 2 is increasing muscle strength. And then the third step, in my opinion, would be to increase range of motion from there. Because once that's done and we increase the range of motion past what was previously their only comfortable range of motion, we now have a brand new end range, which we can then repeat that whole process. We take that new end range, increase the muscle endurance in that range, then increase the strength throughout the entire range of motion that you now have available with the new end range. And then if there's a need, you can go back to the third step for increasing range of motion. It's kind of a rinse-repeat process, but that's not the case for everybody, but that's generally how I like to do things. And the reason why I put range of motion activities last is because, generally speaking, most people that I talk to do some sort of stretching and conditioning or cardio anyway, but not as many people, again, generally speaking, do resistance training, or at least put it up on the same level as those. It's getting a bit better these days, but it's still a common thing that I see. I won't go too much into the benefits of resistance training in this video, just to keep it kind of short. But yeah, to sum up, I'd prefer people focus on stretching and other mobility work after trying to increase their muscle recruitment, because increases in muscle endurance and strength in your available range should automatically allow for a slight, maybe even a bit more than slight increase in range of motion anyway. And then you can just push past that as the need arises. And plus, if a client gets pain from a certain range of motion already, then forcefully increasing that range of motion that they're already not stable or strong in is just asking for injury. That sort of programming is my own opinion and based on my own anecdotal evidence and biases, so you can definitely feel free to disagree. And if you find stretching beneficial and you like to do it, then you know what? You can go ahead and stretch. That's not a big deal, and everybody likes different things. I definitely don't want to push strength training on people that actually enjoy stretching. But based on the evidence, I would definitely, personally, make sure that it's not held on a higher pedestal than other exercise rehab strategies and injury prevention techniques. If you're going to choose to stretch, by all means go ahead. There's nothing wrong with it. The evidence is kind of hit or miss anyway. But my own personal opinion, at least put it on the same level as resistance training and other types of rehab strategies that you may get prescribed from certain clinicians. But anyways, that's all I had to say on the topic. Thanks for listening, and take care.